It all started when I went to get some hair product I ordered at my barber shop. You can't get it anywhere else. The owner of the shop is Terry, a sweet, or so I thought, elderly man who owned the shop for 40 years. It was usually only him working there, along with a few odd others that came and went. I'd been going there ever since I moved to town a few years back. He always gave me the best haircuts. When I arrived to pick up my stuff, I saw that he wasn't in his usual post, sitting in a chair at the register. Instead, I saw a silhouette in the back room behind a curtain. I heard some pretty unsettling choking noises coming from behind that curtain, too. I thought Terry might have been choking, so my hero instinct kicked in, and I rushed to the back room to assist with what I thought was a choking Terry. As I was about to pull the curtain back, Terry came out at an extreme speed and said he was choking on a sandwich for a second, but it had come back up. I felt relieved, but also a little confused. Terry looked frazzled, unkempt, sweaty, like he had just gotten in a fight or been lost in the forest for a couple of days. He brushed it off and gave me my hair product. He also threw in a shampoo, which was enjoyable, until it felt like Terry was digging into my scalp really hard with long, sharp nails. When I went home, I checked in the mirror to see if Terry had done any damage, and sure enough, there were quite a few scratches. They were almost like cat scratches, but nothing too major. I doused the top of my head with isopropyl alcohol, and it burned like hell. I hoped that I didn't have any infection from that old man. I processed the strange occurrence at the barber shop as I drifted off to sleep that night. The second occurrence is when things started to get really strange. It was my next appointment at the shop, about a few weeks after my previous appointment to grab some hair product. I came in expecting Terry to be at his usual spot, but once again he was absent. I noticed there was no one else in the shop, except for Terry, sitting on one of the chairs, looking into the mirror with a maniacal look on his face. I went up to him and called his name to try to get his attention. He didn't move. I put my hand on his shoulder and looked closely at his face, his eyes looking bloodshot and his pupils extremely dilated. I shuddered as I looked at him. Soon after I put my hand on him, he suddenly lunged out of the chair towards me, knocking me to the floor. He almost had me pinned to the ground. His eyes were murderous, and his smile was even bigger as he brought a pair of scissors from his hand and put them close to my neck. Then suddenly he froze, and I too was frozen in sheer terror. I was stuck there for a bit, staring into the lifeless eyes of this old fella that I'd really come to like. After I finally came to my senses, Terry was still just frozen over the top of me. I got out from under him and ran as fast as I could for the door. After I got home that day, I was high-strung. I was cursing, throwing things across the house, and pacing back and forth for hours. What in the hell should I do? I asked myself. The cops really wouldn't believe that a sweet old man, always kind, smiling, and telling stories when he cut your hair, would act like Chucky from Child's Play. Hell, most of the police force probably got their hair cut by him, as there were only 3 barbershops that I knew of in town. Then the thought of a paranormal experience popped into my head. This isn't a movie. There's no way that can actually happen. Maybe he had gone senile. His brain had rotten, and he had gone mad. I tried to stop myself thinking about Terry's delirious behavior, and finally got to bed. I ended up doing it anyway. I phoned the police the next day and told them the gist of what had happened, how Terry had tried to assault me with a pair of scissors. They had me come down to the shop for their investigation, because I was the only witness. When I got there, I told them in great detail what had happened the day before. When I finished the story, I could tell that they didn't really believe me. Terry was the only one at the shop when the police arrived, and he seemed to be back to his usual sweet old man self, contrary to the demon I had encountered just the day before. For the safety of the public, I had them try and get a search warrant for the shop. I mainly just wanted them to search the back room, where I'd heard that odd noise. They succeeded and searched the shop, but they ended up finding nothing incriminating, even in that back room. I had figured that would happen. They wouldn't find any dirt on Terry, and I would likely look like a suspicious fool. Bringing the police into this probably just further influenced Terry's unprompted rage against me. I wondered if when I heard those noises from the back room and went to investigate, maybe I saw or heard something I wasn't supposed to. When it was all said and done in the shop, I was in an interview with the police again. I abruptly felt the piercing gaze of something and averted my eyes from the officer. Standing in the shop window was Terry, his pupils the size of dimes and an unnatural cannibalistic grin on his face. It made me let out a shriek, and the officer looked at me concerned. "You all right, son?" "Yeah, just a sharp pain in my leg." My eyes again drifted back to the spot where Terry had been standing, but he was no longer there. The officer then looked to where I was looking. "What you looking at, kid?" "Nothing. I thought I saw a reflection or something, but it's not there anymore." I wrapped up the interview as quickly as possible, as I knew it was a waste of time. At that point, I knew that Terry wanted to settle this man-to-man. I was going to have to take matters into my own hands, it appeared. I went home and began planning, trying to build up the strength to go back to the barbershop from hell. When I was finally ready, I grabbed a camera for capturing evidence and a knife for self-protection. I didn't want to bring anything else as to remain a little inconspicuous. I went late at night, as I had the feeling that Terry knew I was coming. He would leave the door unlocked for me. I knew now that whatever Terry was, he sure wasn't human, or at least he wasn't anymore. When I arrived at the shop, my intuition proved correct. The door was indeed unlocked. As I entered, I suddenly wondered what had happened to that sweet old man who used to cut my hair. What had happened to him? Was he faking it all along, or had something done away with the kind old man I remembered? I quickly brushed the thought away when I saw the shop was pitch black, except for a faint, glimmering light coming from behind the curtain leading to the back room. I regretted not bringing a flashlight. The atmosphere was eerie, and it gave me the chills. I slowly walked to the red curtain, expecting something wicked on the other side. I cringed as I quickly pulled it aside, but there was nothing. The lone light source was coming from a few candles on a table, melted wax all over it. I began searching in the back area. It had a wooden floor with a couple of stalls, dirty rags and hair scattered all across the floor. After searching for a few minutes and finding nothing, I was starting to think about calling it quits, which, looking back now, I really should have done. I was on my way out when I suddenly heard a faint banging noise. As I went to investigate, I found that the noise was coming from the floor of one of the stalls. I kicked the dirty rags and hair covering the floor aside and lifted up a rug. Underneath it was a small trap door, cut to look flush with the floor. "Wonder how the police didn't find that," I said, and snapped a picture. I lifted up the hatch to find a narrow, dark pit staring back at me, the only way down being a rickety ladder. As I descended the ladder, I realized it was taking quite a long time. I wondered how Terry, or whoever made this place, had managed to dig this pit so deep underground. As I continued thinking, I was interrupted by my feet hitting the ground. I turned around and was met with an almost pitch-black hallway, the only light being let in through the window of an industrial steel door at the end of the hall. As I made my way down the hall and reached the door, I braced myself, took a deep breath, and quickly entered, my soul freezing. It was like a butcher's shop. Dried blood covered the steel walls and the tile floor. There were 2 tables on either side of the room, covered in blood, hair, and gobbets of some animal. I started frantically taking pictures, trying to fight the sheer terror and shiver I was experiencing. After a few minutes, I heard the motor turn on. There was a conveyor belt system on the ceiling, like one of those you'd find in a dry cleaner. They were both moving. This alarmed me, and I put away the camera and drew my knife. After a short while, clothing began coming out of the conveyor system behind the wall. At first, they just looked like poorly made furs, but upon closer inspection, they were definitely not furs. They appeared dried with blood. The fur had been sewn into splotches, as you could see the hide underneath. I spotted a nipple on one of them and was revolted. That's when I realized that these coats were made not from animals, but from humans. The fur on the coats was human hair, and the hide was the skin from a torso. That's when I let out the shrillest scream I had probably ever made. I became frantic, and I was running to the exit. I slipped in a pool of fresh blood and dropped my knife. As I stumbled, trying to get myself back up, I heard the door that was on the other side of the room open, my scream probably alerting whatever was coming. When I thought my heart couldn't go any faster, I saw what was coming through that door. It looked like Terry, judging by the uniform it had on. It had a mask made of hair, with bloody teeth lining the mouth hole. It was armed with a pair of massive shears in one hand, and a straight razor in the other. We stood still and looked at each other for a second. I was freaking out at that point and was frozen in place. I wanted to leave as fast as I could, but my body just wouldn't move. Then the thing started sprinting towards me. and my adrenaline must have really kicked in, because I got up and ran faster than I had ever run in my life. I got to the other side of the steel door I came through and slammed it before the thing could get to it. I bolted down the hallway and started climbing the ladder, afraid it would break with the speed with which I was climbing. I could hear that thing breaking down the door that I had slammed in its face. Finally, I reached the top and threw down the hatch of the trapdoor. I moved a cabinet that was on one of the stalls to the top of the trapdoor and hopefully trapped whatever it was down there. I ran out of that shop in a dazed frenzy. I kept running until I reached home. I passed out that night, and the first thing I did when I woke up was call the police. I still sounded panicked then and could barely begin to explain what was going on. The police sounded confused, saying, "There's no barbershop in town that's owned by someone named Terry." I thought they were playing some sick joke, and I got furious with them. I convinced them to launch another investigation at that address, and they decided to meet me there. When I got there, my mouth was agape. There was no barbershop sign, nothing inside the shop, and certainly no Terry. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. I felt like I was going insane, and I bet the cops also thought I was a loony. I didn't even want to try to explain to them what had happened, because they seemed absolutely oblivious to it. I then remembered that I had the camera with the photos, and decided to show that to them. They took it into evidence and had the film developed. The film, however, had somehow been exposed to sunlight, and the pictures didn't show up. Even though I had bought the film the day before I went to the shop that night, the police wrote me off as some paranoid lunatic and thought nothing of the whole thing. That was almost 5 years ago. I've moved back to my hometown, trying to escape the torment of being in that place, where I almost lost my life in that barbershop from hell. What's making me write this, however, is that I received a letter in my mailbox today. "Hey Mike, it's Terry. I sure do miss you. When's your next appointment? I really look forward to seeing you again." It was sent from a Terry's barbershop, with an address in my current town. Before starting this post, even if it's a story that happened years ago, I just want to make it clear that every name included in this post was changed to make sure to protect the kid's privacy. You see, ever since I met this kid, he's always intrigued me. But no matter how hard I try to ignore the little strange things surrounding him, I can't seem to brush off that awful feeling which shakes my composure. A feeling that creeps on me every time I look at him from afar, from where he can't see me. I was 36, and he was no more than 7. I should be responsible. I was his teacher, be able to rationalize everything and keep my head cool no matter the circumstances. Yet, it's getting harder and harder to act like nothing is wrong with how his brain is working. I'm not trying to inculpate him. I actually fear what his behavior might do to me in the following years, hence why I'm writing this. You see, this particular student, whom I'm calling Basile, for clarity's sake, has always acted a bit out of it, as my colleagues and some of my friends put it. He's a kid that's always loved smiling, for no particular reason. He just loves doing it. However, I started to sense that something was wrong with him when he wouldn't stop, even after getting hurt or messing up in class. I can guarantee that Basile might be the clumsiest student I've ever had. What generally unnerves me the most about Basile, however, is his prolonged periods of complete blackout. He has a tendency to completely shut his brain off to the rest of the world and simply watch in silence the emptiness around him, only coming back with a laugh and teary eyes when someone urges him to respond. It's like he lives in his own little world most of the time. Sadly, it's a major deterrent in his social life. Given that he mostly dozes off or shuts his brain down during class, he's a subject of mockery that can resemble bullying a bit too much for my taste. I try my best to mitigate this negative attention he seems to always get, but that doesn't stop him from slowly becoming a pariah during breaks. To be fair, Basile does have something close to a friend. Well, at least he seems to like him, even if that feeling isn't mutual. It's a kid that I'll call Quentin, and what you should remember about him is that he unfortunately got caught in a car crash with his family. All survived with more or less minor injuries, except for Quentin, who lost the usage of his legs. He was inconsolable for weeks, mostly because he couldn't partake in his favorite sport anymore. That's when Basile started to become extremely interested in him, and when I truly started to see just how deep the rabbit hole surrounded this kid goes. Quentin, after finally gathering the courage to go back to school for the first time in months, was immediately jumped by Basile. Obviously, a lot of them were curious or saddened by his state. Basile, however, really was the only one to be excited about it. He didn't seem to have any ill will towards his now disabled comrade, yet the whole class was off-put by his earnest attempts to cheer Quentin up, often resulting in some fighting and crying on Quentin's side. Strangely, his protests never deterred Basile, who simply continued this thing without bearing any hard feelings or getting angry at the other kids. He became way more active, but was still trapped inside his bubble. He could still spend minutes, maybe hours, just staring into space, especially in class. In the end, I think it worked out, though. After days of trying to make Basile stop bothering Quentin, the latter came to me and simply asked to let him be. Even if I don't know why he's changed so much, he's the only one at school that treats me like a person. Doesn't make everything a pity party. He's kinda nice, even if he's weird, so I don't mind his presence. It didn't feel satisfying at all. Didn't feel right at all. Nonetheless, since both parties seemed content with the situation, I couldn't get involved in all of this. At least, I shouldn't have. But Basile's behavior seemed stranger and stranger to me. He was starting to speak of seeing Quentin walking in an empty space. He drew disturbing imagery, sometimes simply coloring the page with one color, before speaking of the many wonders inside the color. I couldn't bear it anymore. I needed to find its root. I wondered many times before going through with this, if I was going insane. Still, my curiosity and my fear won over my rationality, so I asked Basile to stay in class. He didn't seem to really mind or question why I asked him. Thankfully, he actually came instead of forgetting about the appointment, as he tended to do for anything related with administration. However, his clumsiness or lack of attention led to him hitting a wall and getting the door to his face while trying to walk up to my office. I also noted his lack of focus when I tried to reassure him that he didn't look too bad. He seemed entirely comfortable with how he acted these past few weeks. No regret or self-doubt. This led me to audibly sigh. Basile didn't seem to catch my exasperation. His expression remained unwavering. A small smile, empty eyes, and it was as if he was frozen like a statue. Knowing I wouldn't go far by trying to find a roundabout way to get him to explain his change in attitude, I opted for a more straightforward approach. Basile, I need you to be honest with me. What is it, Teach? The sentence actually piquing his curiosity. I spoke again, hoping my tone wouldn't betray any kind of nervousness. What's going on with Quentin? Why did you suddenly feel the need to be nice towards him? His apathy was replaced by something I couldn't read at the time. He looked extremely embarrassed, but also guilty. And still, he let out a laugh. It didn't sound childish despite his age. It sounded desperate. I can make things right, if I can take care of Quentin. He was starting to shake as his voice became weaker and weaker. However, this sudden show of weakness was quickly replaced by a sudden jump onto my desk. Teach, can I ask you a question? I backed off a bit before actually answering. Sure, but stay in your chair, please. He made a small, apologetic sound before resuming his talking. If something disappears, it's -1, right? I had no idea where he was going with this. Yeah? Ignoring my confusion, he continued. But if something is given in return, it's +1, right? I nodded in response. He was beaming with misplaced pride. He probably misunderstood my confusion or thought getting his teacher confused made him smarter. Well, if -1 meets +1, then they cancel each other out, so nothing has happened in the end. I couldn't bear seeing the conversation get more and more astray, so I asked, Basil, where are you going with this? Then it hit me. Is this about Quentin's lost legs and how you're trying to be an uplifting influence on him? Is that it? I appreciate you trying so hard to brighten his day, but I wasn't sure what to say next, or if him comparing this ordeal to a mathematical operation was a good sign or not. But in the end, I took it as just a little boy being concerned for a classmate's well-being. However, he looked at me strangely. No, the -1 is me. The +1 is Quentin's bad day. I was dead wrong. His cold answer, one that seemed so logical in his mind, frightened me. This was the first time in my career I felt any kind of fear towards one of my pupils. I struggled to get out another word, but I needed to know more. What do you mean by that? He smiled brightly, innocently. Well, I'm a bad kid, so this accident gives me a chance to be better. Flabbergasted, outraged, speechless. These words wouldn't even be enough to describe how I was feeling at that moment. Several thoughts plagued my mind. What kind of 7-year-old thinks and acts this way? How can he say things like that with such a carefree attitude? What about that moment of weakness? Did I imagine it? I tried to pry a bit more, but he wouldn't speak about it. His brain had shut down when I asked about why he thought of himself this way. He left my office without listening to me, that unnerving boy disappearing from my view, although his little cries in the corridor didn't escape my ears. I had the urge to join him in the corridor and comfort him, especially if he actually was putting up a front when talking about his self-esteem issues. Yet I stopped myself. I rationalized that me suddenly showing up wouldn't help him open up to me. But as he left, I heard his footsteps coming to a sudden halt. A weak "Dad" was all I could fully understand, before the footsteps came back in my direction. Basil was standing in my doorway, his eyes darker than anything I'd ever seen. He wasn't saying anything, just looking at me at what felt like an eternity. I tried to say something, but the words just died in my throat. He opened his mouth to answer my almost question. If only I could trade your life for his, you invading prick. But it was deep, too deep. His voice couldn't belong to a child. Still, Basil was the only thing in front of me. He had to have said it. I was petrified. He left without saying another word. The suffocating silence of the classroom was all that reminded me of the fact that I was alive. After minutes, maybe hours, I continued my usual routine as if nothing had happened. I locked the classroom, went to my car, and drove myself home as I sat on my rundown sofa. Nothing out of the ordinary. Except I had no recollection of ever doing that. It was as if my mind had been completely shut down. I simply awoke in the middle of the night, briefly wondering how I even got back to my flat before going back to sleep. Well, sleep is a generous word to describe what happened that night. Nightmares kept me company, and I had to call off the next day due to my unbelievable tiredness. Eventually, I calmed down and went back to my job, but I became wary of Basil. I found myself staring at him more and more, hoping to prevent him from catching me by surprise. However, my behavior ended up being a frequent subject of questions and discussions among the students. Not wanting the situation to get out of control, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I needed to stop being worried about one of my students, especially if my behavior could end up damaging said student's reputation. I was a professional. I couldn't let my bias overtake my duties. I was scared. It pains me to admit it now, but I found myself terrified of Basil. Being scared of a grade schooler. How pathetic. That's why it took me a month to properly gather up the courage to ask for a meeting with his family. In the meantime, the rumors had begun to run rampant, and some people tried to bully Basil. I felt ashamed. It was exactly what I had predicted. Yet I could not act to defend this child. Luckily, Quentin had stepped in, even amongst his former friends. I wasn't sure if their friendship was healthy, but I was glad he was around, no matter how uncomfortable I got while watching them play. Sometimes, Basil would show Quentin people or events that didn't seem to exist or happen. He could also hurt him by saying that he could see him running freely somewhere, or abruptly stop his movements to cry out at something. As for Quentin, sometimes he would brawl with Basil, or a bully, but most of the time, he would push Basil out of harm's way. It was strange how poor his luck seemed to be. Nonetheless, they were happy like this. I didn't know what to think. Still, I needed to meet his family. So, I stopped finding excuses. That's why 2 weeks later, I found myself at the doorstep of a small but seemingly cozy house. I was greeted by a middle-aged lady, looking slightly older than I was. She invited me in, but I found no sign of Basil, only pictures of him with a man I didn't recognize. When I asked her about her son, her face illuminated with motherly joy. "Oh, my little angel isn't here right now. He's currently playing with his new friend." I tried to get her to clarify what she meant. "Are you talking about Quentin?" She clapped her hands together. "Yes, that's his name. He's one of your students, I assume." Poor thing. She didn't add anything else, but she didn't have to. She knew about the accident. That meant I could safely bring out the topic of Basil's behavior more easily. I cleared my throat. "Yeah, Quentin's been the subject of something terrible." She cut me off before I could add anything else. "That's why I'm proud of my baby for deciding to become his friend. I was scared he would end up alone, but to hear that those two are getting along so well, it's truly a miracle." The heavy feeling in my chest came back. No point in beating around the bush. I needed to be more direct. "About that, miss, I think your son's not being a healthy support system for Quentin." Her cheerful behavior slowly faded away, being replaced by something I could only describe as saddened resignation. Her smile was still there, but much thinner, her eyes pleading me to stop talking. A faint, "Oh no," left her lips. I found it strange that his first friend was handicapped because of... I found myself insisting, pushing her to tell me why Basil is the way he is. Tears started to stroll down her face, so I reassured her. "Miss, I want to help both of these kids, but please, be honest with me. What happened to Basil? Why is he the way that he is?" Regardless of her tears, her eyes looked into mine. The sadness and fatalism were mixed together in a stare I would remember my entire life. "Basil heard his father die in a car crash while on the phone with him." Despite sitting in a chair, I felt my entire body grow heavier with each passing second. I couldn't move. Images were flashing inside my head. "I'm so sorry for your loss," I said to the woman, who was now barely holding her tears. My words were sincere, but they must have sounded so fake to someone who's still in grievance. Still, I continued to talk in hopes that I would learn more and diffuse the situation. "If I'm not being too indiscreet," "You already were, you idiot," I told myself. "May I learn more about Basil, how he was prior to this, and how this affected him?" His mother silently nodded, eyes still red, and told me everything. "You see, my son has always been a secluded person with a view of the world that nobody could fully grasp. Among what you would describe, like seeing fictional persons or drawing moves on his own, are things he actually did before. Thankfully, his father did his best to connect with him, and it worked. Basil was always excited to show him his new creation or talk about his latest epiphany, but then the tragedy struck." A hiccup interrupted her tale, so I timidly tried to reassure her. "If it's too hard for you, don't feel obliged to continue." She shook her head. "No, I feel it's good to let everything out. Another oddity surrounding Basil is his poor luck. Whenever he tries to do something, most of the time it backfires. Some of the more superstitious members of the family even ended up thinking he was cursed. That's obviously not the case. It's ridiculous. But only my husband, his father, had the strength to protest, defend him, against them." Hearing this, a question came to me. Is that outlook on his luck one of the reasons he mostly prefers to keep to himself? She offered a weak, "I don't know," as a response before saying, "At least fictional characters can't hurt him." Another pause in the conversation happened, the air gradually becoming tenser and tenser. He heard everything. When I asked him to phone his father, I never expected. Her face gradually lost her color. That should have been my cue to stop prodding. But I didn't. I was foolish enough to continue. I've also seen Basil get lost in his mind, even with his new friend. He can cry or laugh about whatever he sees. Is there something other than fictional characters or famous people that he can think about? Has he ever talked to you about it? Wordlessly, his mother stood up and incited me to follow her up the stairs. A bit of a silent walk later, we arrived in the attic, where a little box stood out. It was well kept compared to the dusty furniture all around it. She opened it and took out a stack of papers. "He never explicitly told me, but I've seen his drawings," she said before handing them over. I felt like I was going to cry myself. Most had little notes in the left corner, explaining when or how he saw these visions. Most were crudely drawn, but strong with emotions. Some had Quentin happily walking. Some had Basil's father cuddling him or coming to school to take him home. But others were red or black, scribbled messes. Me when Dad got hurt. Dad going elsewhere. Quentin leaving. Me when Mom doesn't love me anymore. His imagination was completely corrupted by tragedy. No matter how hard he tried to forget it, his subconscious would catch up. His positive daydreams would turn to nightmares. He blamed himself for everything. I could now understand what he meant, despite how twisted his -1+1 explanation sounded. He was just a kid, trying to fix his mistake after being given another chance. Although with that said, one of his drawings intrigued me more than others. It was a poorly drawn representation of himself, being held by the throat by a black figure. "He haunts me." I presented it to his mother. "Miss, what is that? What are you doing?" It was that voice again, the voice that shouldn't belong to a child. The two of us turned around instinctively to see Basil, knife in hand, an expression of pure rage on his face. His mother tried to calm him down. "Basil, snap out of it." However, instead, his eyes locked onto me, with a look of hatred so intense, he couldn't just describe it with words. He rushed at me and stabbed violently at my knee. The pain was unbelievable. Yells, blood, cries. That's all I saw before I fainted from shock. When I awoke, I was being taken by ambulance. The mother was frantically apologizing to me. I tried to reassure her, but when I saw Basil showing no remorse next to her, I couldn't bring myself to be gentler with her. My fears had come back, and his eyes haunted me to this day. What was he talking about in that drawing? Surely ghosts aren't real. However, what is it that possesses him during these violent outbursts? I think I'll never know for sure. After I recovered from my leg wound, at least as much as I could, the school administration made no concessions. Seeing that I was now forced to have a cane with me for the rest of my life, they promptly excluded Basil from school. Quentin tried to continue going to school, but the bullying and rumors were too tough even for him. He begged to be sent where Basil was. Apparently they reunited in some sort of youth re-education center. I had no idea if I should be opposed to this decision, but it didn't matter. Sadly, that's all there is to it. These conversations and drawings did give me the insight on how Basil saw the world. A lonely place that he might make friendlier, but I couldn't help him. His deep-rooted self-loathing, his general lack of focus, his obsession with Quentin. Speaking of which, neither of them showed up at the class reunion, which happened this year. According to one of their classmates, the soul who actually saw them after they went to rehab, it was better that way. Had Basil crossed a line? Had he rendered Quentin so dependent on him? Just like a lot of things in this post, I don't know. I couldn't even think or say anything when the student told me about it. So, here I am, now 48, 13 years have passed. Multiple children became my pupils, and I didn't encounter another bacille ever again. The doubts are eating me alive as I write this, for failing to offer any kind of solution, for letting this disturbing kid get away. Am I a failure as a teacher? On the day that my friend and I went searching for the Catawanga, I lay in a field of cotton-spun dandelions and roasted in the evil gleam of the sun. It was one of the dog days of summer, when all the shadows are golden and the days never end. It just runs languidly onward like a paint smear. The sky was pristine blue of a hydrangea flower, without a cloud in sight. Every so often, Elliot would leap up excitedly, claiming he could see a cloud forming, but it was always a plane or a trick of the light or a runaway dandelion waltzing through the air. Chris grabbed Elliot's ankle as he went to jump up again and shoved him back onto the grass. "There's no goddamn clouds." "Language?" Elliot looked mildly offended. Chris snorted. He was a football player through and through, with huge shoulders and a temper to match. So I quickly got up in the hopes of heading off a confrontation. "I'm bored. Let's go play catch or something." Chris started to agree, but paused. A dangerous light came into his eyes, and I was immediately afraid. According to Chris, his ideas were brilliant. According to literally anyone else, they were insane. Like the time he'd suspended the school weeb, Peter, from a tree branch to see if the squirrels would eat him. Peter had hung him there like an overweight flag for 6 hours. "Have you guys heard of the Catawanga?" He stared straight at Elliot as he said it. "I heard that it lurks in the old Fairground and eats bad kids who wander off. It's got the eyes of a snake, and it ties the bones of its victims into its fur. Little Willie's cousin saw it, and he said it has claws like... Chris fumbled for the right words. "Knives?" I suggested. "Yeah, like knives. There's no such thing. It's probably some animal." Elliot didn't sound very sure of himself, though. Of course, I knew about the Catawanga. Everybody in town knew about it. The stories were many and conflicting. In some, it was a great dragon who hoarded the skulls of children and only brought them out during rainy nights to admire them in the light of the moon. In others, the Catawanga was a great man-beast abandoned by his family, bitter and afraid of the world. But always, it lived in the abandoned fairground, and always, it was very, very hungry. In my town's heyday, people came from all over the world to see the famous Grenadine Circus, open all year round and fun for the whole family. But that was a long time ago. What I knew about the circus came from the old geezers clustered around the creaky folding tables, telling stories about their youth. Everyone knew that half those stories were made up, and the other half, well, they might as well be. But I had always been fascinated by the circus. Or rather, I was fascinated by the way all the adults treated it. The Catawanga was not regarded as one of the harmless legends for the little kids to tell when they were warm and safe around the campfire. To my parents, to the parents of all the other kids that I knew, the Catawanga was real, and the circus was to be avoided at all costs. "The Catawanga isn't real," Elliot said again, more firmly. "Probably everyone freaked out about a cougar or a tiger or a really hairy guy." "We don't get those around here," I hesitated. "Well, we do get hairy people, but I've never seen any predators bigger than that ugly babysitter of yours." The last remark was directed at Chris. "Right, everybody shut up. I'm going to the fairground, and y'all are chicken if you don't come." Under the dire threat of being called a chicken, Elliot and I followed Chris as he confidently strolled away. My town was given a name by the 20-somethings who lived there, the ones who were too old to be satisfied with the tiny lives they lived here, but too young to accept that big lives were meant for big kids born in big cities far away from people that believed in Catawangas. The 20-somethings called my town Satan's Soul because it was so small. My friends and I made it to the fairground in less than 10 minutes. Vines twined up the poles that held up a sign which proudly proclaimed Grenadine Circus. It was barely recognizable, It had decaying wooden things that might once have been stalls, ground covered in leaves that crunched at every step, and anthills. Lots and lots of anthills. Chris smacked his meaty palms together. "Let's go hunt us some Catawanga meat." Elliot rolled his eyes. We walked into the circus together, because when we actually got there, Chris didn't seem all that keen to go first. Elliot trailed his fingers over a row of half-submerged cages. I wonder where all the animals went when the circus shut down. There was a crashing sound to the side. Elliot and I looked over to see a half-exposed basement with a ladder leading down into it. Chris moaned at the bottom. I rushed up, sliding down the ladder, and grabbed at Chris. "Dude, are you all right?" He started crying, great sobbing gasps that gradually transformed into hysterical laughter. You should have seen your face." Chris stood up and dusted himself off, pleased at his prank. I sighed and turned to leave, but growls from the back of the room stopped me. "It's probably just the wind." "It's just the wind," I said, doing my best to sound sure. But nails scraped along stone, undermining my words. "That's it. I'm out." Chris retreated up the ladder. "Chicken," Elliot yelled at his back. "The Catawanga isn't real." The growls got louder. "The Catawanga isn't real." Elliot's face was pale. "I'm not leaving. I'm not a chicken." I tried to pull Elliot away, but he stood his ground. "The Catawanga isn't real," Elliot screamed into the black of the room, as if he could wish the shadowy shape moving at the back of the room into non-existence. "The Catawanga isn't real, and we don't get predators here, and you aren't allowed to be real." He bellowed the words out as if some tiny, important thing was about to be broken, and that was the last thing he could ever say. I glanced at the shape. It was just a lump of shadows in the corner. I grabbed Elliot's arm and decided I didn't want to see it move. I talked to him calmly, projecting what I didn't feel. "Elliot, come on, let's go. It'll be okay, Elliot. We have to leave now." Growls bubbled up from behind me. "Elliot, move!" Elliot's face went pale. He pointed over my shoulder with one trembling finger. The bear was rather pathetic. It lunged for us, but only made it halfway, banging its nose against the ground and whimpering like a petulant child. The bear's fur was falling out in patches. Its eyes were covered with milky white film, and it sniffed the air, trying to find its dinner. All those years of being endlessly crammed onto bicycles and paraded around like an oversized dog, followed by years alone in the fairground, had taken their toll on the creature. Despite that, it was very big and very obviously hungry. "But we don't get bears here," I said stupidly. "I told you," Elliot whispered. "I asked what happened to the circus animals, and now we know. I told you so." I grabbed Elliot by the arm and pulled him out of the basement. As we scrambled up the ladder, I glanced back. The last thing I saw was the faded red collar around the bear's neck, the last remnant of the Grenadine circus. Elliot and I met Chris by the edge of the grounds and told him about the bear. I guess the Catawanga isn't real, just some dumb kids making up stories about a bear. He sounded disappointed, even though he had run away from the bear like he had bees in his pants. Yeah, I guess. I was relieved, though. Something moved in the trees. The wind died down suddenly, and I could just barely hear a scraping that sounded like long, long claws sliding across concrete. The sound got louder and louder, built until I could feel the vibrations in my chest. There was a figure inside the gate, large and bulbous, with limbs protruding at seemingly random angles. One of those limbs held a limp hunk of meat that still had a red collar around its neck. It didn't have a face, but something about the way it lounged there made it seem undeniably smug. Chris wasn't the only one who ran away that time. I never saw the Catawanga again, but as soon as I turned 18, I moved away with no plans and no money. Elliot left too, but Chris stayed. He'd always been stubborn like that. On my 20th birthday, he was found headless, just outside the Fairgrounds. So, once upon a time, back when I was about 20, a friend of mine got into some trouble and went to jail. He needed someone to go and stay at his place and take care of his elderly dog and keep his birds fed. I immediately accepted, as I didn't really want to live with my mom and her new, younger boyfriend. Now, here's where I should probably mention that my friend was into some not-so-great stuff. That's how he ended up in jail. So naturally, that meant that some pretty shady characters were going to be around. Those characters usually waited until I went to bed to start coming around and helping themselves to whatever they desired. That was bad enough in its own, but since my friend couldn't pay his electric bill from jail, there were also no lights. Since the bedroom I was staying in had a deadbolt and another lock, I felt okay in there. I of course realized how stupid and naive I was back then. After all, I'm only 5'3", and back then I only weighed about 100 pounds. I guess my desperation for independence drove me to brave it. I would literally wake up the next day to find footprints outside the living room window, and even found the phone line cut once or twice. While all that was going on, my friend's creepy-ass, teeth-missing, pervy landlord started randomly showing up. The landlord only lived about 3 football fields away. Apparently my friend couldn't pay rent from jail either. He also didn't want me to tell his landlord that he was in jail, so I had to keep giving some stupid excuse about him being away at his family's. But that excuse only went so far. Probably knowing full well that it was bullshit, the landlord started showing up even more. When he did, he started saying nasty things like, "My wife and I sure would be excited to have you over, especially in a bikini." Soon enough, though, the landlord started getting angrier and more frustrated. Each and every time he would show up, he would just show up at any given time, and since I didn't drive at the time, I was usually there for these unfortunate visits. Eventually, he just started straight up walking in, not even bothering to knock anymore. I told him that was illegal, but he didn't seem to care. Remember earlier in the story, I mentioned that I slept with a locked door? Well, unfortunately on that particular morning, I had already gotten up and made a trip to the kitchen for some water after the sun had already come up. Because of the daylight, I didn't bother locking the bedroom again. I just closed it. Not long after that, I had fallen back asleep. A strange, slight noise woke me up. It was a sort of soft clicking sound. I gradually opened my eyes, but I didn't see anything, so I tried to go back to sleep. But then, I suddenly started back awake, as I could just feel another presence in the room with me. As I slowly focused my eyes on the light, I saw the old landlord standing over me, mouth breathing with a creepy grin on his sinister face. I instantly bolted upright, whilst grabbing the bed sheets and pulling them over my body. Then I went from 0 to 60 in less than a second. I jumped up and started yelling about, "What the hell are you doing here? What do you think you're doing right now?" All the while, I continued walking towards him angrily. He backed away, practically running out the door. I locked it behind him and screamed, "I'm calling the cops." The cops came, but since I had no proof and he hadn't hurt me, they really couldn't do much. To this day, though, I'll never forget the sound of that old man mouth breathing as he leaned over my sleeping, unsuspecting body. Ryan could only take so much of the smell of pumpkins, and Linda had been carving one a day for 2 weeks. He tried to tell her that the people smashing the pumpkins she bought every day were going to do it as long as she kept putting one out every night. Ryan even joked that it was the people selling her the pumpkins who were destroying them, and were only going to keep doing it as long as she kept buying them. Linda, however, wouldn't take that for an answer. It was a matter of principle for her. She would not be bullied, and would carve a pumpkin every day until Halloween, if that was what it took. Dealing with Linda and her pumpkins was one thing, but an entire morning of hearing her talking to her girlfriend on the phone about the imagined vendettas against her were a little much. There was no room in the house that allowed escape from it either, not with the rotary phone's extra long cord. She even wrote to the Whisper Alley Echoes, seeking their advice, but their response was not what she wanted. She wanted to be told that she was right, and that someone had a thing against Halloween. Needing a break from the conspiracy, Ryan would go to the garage to tinker with his '87 Mazda 626 Turbo, or keep himself busy with chores outside, mostly mowing the lawn one last time before the snow and winterizing the four-wheeler. The days turned into weeks, and Ryan was surprised just how much a pumpkin a day ended up costing him. What saved Ryan on most of these days was Linda's afternoon jogs around the lake. Since the pumpkins, Ryan only felt like he could be in the house when his wife was gone, and that made him a little sad. Whatever was going on with Linda, it was just a phase. Halloween would be the last time he would have to worry about the pumpkins. On most days, when Ryan had time to himself, he would turn on the TV, but today, his '87 Mazda was going to finally be road ready. He was really hoping that all the tinkering he'd been doing, which was keeping the car off the road for most of the summer, was going to increase the zip exponentially. A little over an hour after leaving for her jog, Linda returned and went to the garage where Ryan was listening to his favorite music so she could speak to him and be heard. She said that she was on her way to take a shower and felt like renting a movie that night after the two of them went out to eat, suggesting Moe's Bar. Later, after Linda and Ryan got showered and dressed, they went into town in the Mazda Ryan was proud to show off. Even though Moe's Bar didn't have a dance floor, the young married couple danced and ate the night's special, meatloaf sandwiches, mashed potatoes with gravy, and mac and cheese and peas. When they were finished eating, they had lost track of time and realized that it was too late to rent a movie. Figuring since both of them had friends of theirs at Moe's, the couple stayed in order to catch up. Ryan was drinking, and if Linda didn't intervene when she did, loading Ryan into the truck, he wouldn't have been able to stand up on his own feet for another hour. During the drive back to the house, Linda wanted someone to talk to, but Ryan nodded off. In the middle of talking about how she traded shifts and was off the next day, Linda slammed on the brakes, waking Ryan up. "You saw that, right?" Linda shouted, pointing to the end of the driveway. "I wasn't looking. They were coming to smash my pumpkins," Linda said and honked the horn. "Yeah, screw off." "Babe," Ryan said, trying to get her to lay off the horn. "It's nearly 1 a.m. "I saw one of those bastards at the end of the driveway," Linda said, snarling out the word bastards. She put the car into motion again and flicked on the high beams to search for where she had last seen them dart into the woods. This time, she saw nothing. Linda drove another 30 feet before she turned the lights back onto the woods. "Keep looking," Linda said. "I saw something." "It's fine," Ryan groaned, rubbing his shoulder and thankful that he was wearing a seatbelt. "Probably just a deer." "And if it was a person?" Linda demanded. "Then do what the Whisper Alley echoes said and stop putting out the pumpkins. It's a month until Halloween. They will get bored with it. Hell, get one of those plastic ones instead. It's cheaper that way." Linda was frustrated and didn't say another word as she continued searching. After a while, she gave up looking and returned home. Being the first to get in the house, she closed the bedroom door behind her. Ryan would have to sleep on the couch, it seemed. The next day, Ryan was called into work. The overtime was welcome, considering the previous night. He waited until lunch to call Linda to patch things up before he got home, but the line was busy. Ryan chalked this up to her gossiping to her friends on the phone, something she was doing every day for the last week. Ryan never understood how people could talk that much. Never seeing a reason to air his dirty laundry in public, Ryan didn't share this story to anyone at work. He was the silent type, exactly the thing that got Linda interested, and the thing that gets him in trouble with her the most. Before leaving work, he called a second time, and again, there was no answer. This time, the line went to the machine. Ryan knew this meant she was pissed, and nearly took a co-worker up on their offer to buy the first round. However, Ryan decided to go home. On the way back home, Ryan made one stop to pick up a plastic pumpkin to use instead of the real ones Linda kept spending all their money on. As Ryan walked in the front door, he saw that she was reading a book on the couch. When he asked why she didn't answer the phone, she shrugged but said nothing. Obviously, she was still mad. "Sorry about last night," Ryan said. At first, it was soft, but soon he started to talk at a normal volume. "I dozed off and I didn't take you seriously. I don't know what you saw, but I believe you when you said you saw someone. I got this," he said, as he handed her the plastic pumpkin. Linda didn't take it, so Ryan set it on the couch arm so he could go fetch himself a hot cocoa in the kitchen. "It was those damn Presleys," Linda swore. That stopped Ryan in his tracks. "Why do you say so?" "There were 4 of them," Linda answered, her eyes back on the page of the book she was reading. "They ran to their farm." "Well, let's keep a cool head for now," Ryan said. making his way back to the kitchen. He knew Linda, and since she had something in her crosshairs, he had to step in quick before smashed pumpkins escalated into something more serious. Linda didn't say anything to this and went back to reading. In the silence, Ryan was afraid that she might already have done something. Linda started using the plastic pumpkin, and even though she could never admit it out loud, she was glad for it. With a little more peace of mind, she could shift her attention towards Halloween. She had pieced together a costume in her spare time for her and Ryan over the last year, and was looking forward to wearing it at the Halloween party. If there was going to be a contest at the small-town mixer, she was certain their zombie soldiers would win. Before leaving to go to the Halloween party, Linda made it a point to put out the real pumpkins, because it was Halloween, and beside it, a bowl of candy for any potential trick-or-treaters that might arrive. Being so far away in the woods, and being in a small town like Gray Hill, she wasn't expecting any. The party was small, but nice, and the two ended up getting 4th place, something that irritated Linda to no end because 4th place was total BS. The party ended early due to poor road conditions and the citywide curfew, so the couple was home at 7:15. The sun had already fallen from the sky, and Linda was drunk enough to think waiting out in the nearby bush for the Presleys was a good idea. Before they even got the truck in the parking lot, Linda was asking Ryan to join her. Ryan was also too drunk, just not drunk enough to join his wife, who was more drunk on anger for those who had hurt her favorite holiday. So he declined and went into the house. After making some instant coffee in the microwave and putting it in a thermos that matched the military look, Linda waited silently in the bushes that gave her a good line of sight to the direction of the most likely way the Presleys would come from. The light was off, but the candle in the jack-o'-lantern was lit and burned like a beacon on her porch in the cloudy night. Remembering that the article said not to bring a weapon, she wished she had taken her .22 with her. If she fired, the only people who would be around would be behind her. Even though she didn't think she would need it, she wished that she had it. It would make her more comfortable than the plastic gun she was holding from the Halloween party. She was nearing falling asleep when she heard a rustling. After a moment, she realized the noise wasn't coming from the Presleys' direction. It was to her right. That didn't make sense. Linda kept low to remain hidden. Those crafty Presleys were close. Linda froze there for a few long seconds and listened to every sound around her with suspicion. It wasn't long until Linda came to the conclusion that the Presleys had walked through the swamp. When the footfalls passed her, Linda held her breath for 5 seconds before she started to move. She was going to leap out and hit them with the pretend rifle she was holding for the Halloween party. She swore to God she would. Pushing herself off the ground, Linda half charged at what she thought was one of the Presleys. The other half was slowly realizing that she had no idea what in hell she was looking at. The tall, mangy things were at least 8 feet tall and covered in hair. It dawned on her that she was looking at Bigfoot. Bigfoot wasn't real. Linda kept coming up with reasons why it couldn't be Bigfoot, even though they turned to look at her and she was telling herself that whatever she was looking at had to be a costume. 2 people wore costumes in the swamp on a cold, wet Halloween night. That didn't make sense either. Linda wrestled with the possibility of Bigfoot's existence as she watched the 2 scamper away. Seeing how large they were, she was amazed they didn't lumber. Dumbstruck, Linda stood there, her mouth agape for a long moment before she decided to just go home. On the way back, she mulled over what she was going to tell everyone, including Ryan. She knew they would think she was crazy if she said anything. There were people in town who said they saw some strange things, and she always thought they were nuts. Making her way up the steps after taking off her boots and jacket, Linda slid into bed, hoping not to wake Ryan, who was fast asleep. She slept awkward, laying there, listening to Ryan snore less than 5 feet away, seeing a secret she would keep to herself for the rest of her life.